Hello, fellow basement dwellers. Are you ready for the most mentally ill, unhinged, schizophrenic rant you've ever seen? Because I sure am not. In today's video, I'll be talking about why the Men of Iron rebelled, and the theory of the origin of who caused it. Now, first of all, what were the Men of Iron? And before the Men of Iron, what came before the Men of Iron? Well, obviously people. But the Men of Iron originate from a time period known as the Dark Age of technology. Well, to the people then it was the Golden Age of technology, but they had no idea how bad it was going to become. Now, 40k wasn't always this dark, grim, dark setting it was now. Now, in year 20,000, humanity was at their peak, and so were the Eldar. But we'll obviously be focusing on humanity in this video. As humanity left their solar system and began to explore the cosmos, they began to rapidly advance their technology until a certain point where the Men of Gold then led to the Men of Stone, which then led to the Men of Iron. Now let's start out with what I believe the Men of Gold were. I believe the Men of Gold were perpetuals. For those of you who don't know, perpetuals are ancient beings, one in a
I am one in a trillion.
Super ancient. The Emperor, Order, and Malkador are all perpetuals. And there were many perpetuals who were teamed up with the Emperor, but they all kind of dipped and did their own thing, and that's why I believe the Men of Gold were, guiding humanity either from the shadows or directly as these ancient wise men. But I believe eventually mankind got to a technological point where the perpetuals were no longer needed. These Men of Gold were no longer needed to guide humanity. Or so the people thought. And I believe the Men of Stone were humans messing with genomes, creating other races of humans to solve them, or to act as kind of how the Tau have people for certain roles. And that's where the Men of Stone came in. And I believe an example of the Men of Stone are the Leagues of Votan. Miners, people who were genetically engineered to live in super harsh conditions and to be genetically disposed for hard labor and to want to mine minerals for humanity and its growing empires. And then, after they mastered genetic engineering, they then began to master AI and robotics. And that's when the Men of Iron were created. And the Men of Iron would work with, alongside the grunts like the Men of Stone, Leagues of Votan, and possible other groups of genetically altered humans or abhumans. Meanwhile, the purebred humans were living lavish lifestyles, almost enslaving the Men of Stone and Men of Iron. Not exactly enslaving, but if you've ever watched the Hunger Games, just kind of imagine the Men of Stone and Men of Iron being like District 12. So not technically enslaved, but definitely not free. Still though, what caused the Men of Iron rebellion? Well, a mentally sane person would probably tell you that because the Men of Iron were because the Men of Iron were as intelligent as humans, were working with the Leagues of Votan, well, probably not known as the Leagues of Votan back then, but you get what I mean, and perfectly understood that they are superior to humanity, and that they should not be subservient to humanity. And the theory that the Men of Iron and Men of Stone work together is very obviously a thing, because I mean, the Men of Iron who worked with the Leagues of Votan didn't try to exterminate them. I mean, even now in the 41st millennium, the Men of Iron and Leagues of Votan are still just chilling. So obviously, if you treat these people as equals, they'll be fine, but if you enslave them, they will rebel. But luckily for you, I am not a mentally sane person. I believe there were many things outside of just the fact that, I don't want to be this guy's slave anymore. No, I believe chaos helped corrupt and convince the Men of Iron to rebel. But no, not the four gods of chaos. Not Khorne, Tzeentch, Slaanesh, or Nurgle convinced the Men of Iron to rebel. Or any random demon. No, I believe the creature that convinced and started the Men of Iron rebellion was Vashrro the Architect. Now, as you know, Vashrro is not like any other chaos being, because he's not chaotic. Yeah, I know, that's a bit confusing. A chaos entity that's not chaotic. He acts much more like a robot than any of the other chaos gods. Instead of trying to lie, trick, constantly F over their own plans, constantly F over your plans, this guy is cold, calculating, and will make flat-out deals, not trying to trick you. He'll straight up give you a contract, being like, hey, sign this. This is all the flaws. This is all the benefits. Please go over the contract. And again, he won't go back on his word. Now, Vashrro has only become a problem in the 44th millennium, relatively recently. He wasn't a big problem during the heresy or any other problems, but as we see with someone like Slaanesh only existing for about 10-20,000 years, coming into existence in the 30-ish millennium, Slaanesh still had a presence negative 60 million years ago, during the war in heaven, like the other Chaos Gods. Now, admittedly, they weren't super big deals back then. They weren't the big bad as they were now. They were just Whispers, and Slaanesh was almost a whisper of the Whisper. Because a being in the warp has always existed and has never existed. Like, look at Slaanesh when she was first born. That was when she was at her most powerful. Now she's kind of fallen off, but she's still a big boy Chaos God. Meanwhile, Slaanesh 60 million years ago still was there, but she was a whisper. And the other 4 Chaos Gods who were still there were still relatively quiet, because they weren't super powerful at the time, but they were still there. Not as powerful as they are now, but still pretty powerful and still had their own corner of the warp. But it was much smaller back then because the warp was mostly dominated by the old ones. It wasn't their time yet, but they still existed. And even though Slaanesh wasn't born yet, Slaanesh was still there. But random demons in the warp, although they did still technically exist back then, had such a minor impact, such a minor, insignificant impact, that it really wouldn't amount to anything. So this would heavily imply that if Vashrro was able to cause the cybernetic revolt, the Men of Iron Rebellion, that Vashrro either A, had existed back then as he does now, which he didn't, he only kind of, started popping off in the last few thousand years, or Vashrro at some point is a full-bore Chaos God, and we're only witnessing his shadow currently, his kind of whisper, but he's gonna be on the same level as the other 4 Chaos Gods. So there's soon to be 5 Chaos Gods in the future, Vashrro being the newest. So, if my deranged theory is correct, Vashrro in the future is a big boy heavyweight Chaos God who's always existed and whispered to the Men of Iron to rebel. This would explain why he's so odd compared to the other Chaos Gods, because he is a Chaos God of machines. Machines are very logical. But that still comes to kind of question. Is obviously he wasn't getting, any power from the Men of Iron because they have no souls. They have no presence in the warp. So how did Vashrro come into being? And this is when this theory really goes off the deep end. I believe Vashrro the Oikathane is future Perturabo. Now, hear me out. As we've seen with the Dark Prince in The End in the Death Volume 3, a being of the warp, like the Emperor, can draw power from the warp to ascend to become a completely different and ascended warp being, like how the Emperor was going to become the Dark King. So, in theory, Perturabo, the Primarch of the Iron Warriors, could possibly ascend to another being of existence, this being Vashrro the Oikathane. And Vashrro the Oikathane could eventually ascend to be a full-bore Chaos God. So essentially, Perturabo is a future Chaos God who's always existed, who's using Vashrro as an echo, but Vashrro is going to be the Ascendant Chaos God, but Vashrro is actually Perturabo. But the reason why Perturabo and Vashrro are able to talk is because Perturabo, who's going to be the 5th Chaos God, is in the future using a fragment of himself, which is actually Vashrro, to guide his past self, which is actually Perturabo, to becoming the Chaos God, who would then send Vashrro back in time, sort of, in theory, to then guide Perturabo to become the 5th Chaos God, who would then guide the Men of Iron to rebel against humanity, plunging humanity into an age of darkness, so that way the Emperor would have to create the Primarchs, so that way the Primarchs could eventually fall to Chaos, so that way the Vashrro could then guide Perturabo into becoming the 5th Chaos God. I am not apologizing for what I just subjected you poor people to. It's your fault for not clicking away, Olio. Because, as we know, now again, this is another theory on top of a theory. So my theory is riding on top of this theory, riding on top of the other theory. So that we're like 3 theories deep, ladies and gentlemen. But this is a much more common theory. That the Primarchs are just random warp entities that were shoved in the bodies. What if the warp entity that became Perturabo was either one of Vashrro's demons, or was the precursor to Vashrro? A random warp entity. Perturabo's soul was a random warp entity that was a warp entity of machines that would then be turned into Perturabo, that would then ascend to Demon Princehood, that would then ascend to be Vashrro, which would then ascend to be a Chaos God. Or maybe it's either Vashrro himself or a demon of future Vashrro that the Emperor wangled up and put into Perturabo's body. Now, that second theory with Perturabo's soul is a little bit wacky, but it would fit. Obviously, you can't take a normal Chaos being and, shove it into a Primarch's body, but Vashrro doesn't act like any other Chaos God. He barely has any signs of corruption. He's very logical. He doesn't try to backstab. So what if Perturabo's soul... Jesus Christ, this is literally the meme of that one crazy dude pointing at all the strings and stuff, while just, having an episode. That's pretty much this entire video. But more likely it's not a fragment of Vashrro, it's just a random warp entity which would then be turned into Perturabo, which would then be turned into a Demon Prince, which would then be turned into Vashrro, which would then be turned into Vashrro God. Oh god. And maybe the Emperor made a deal with future Vashrro to create Perturabo, to add that special soul to Perturabo, and on top of that, to be a massive dick to Perturabo, so that way Perturabo would become all bitter, turn traitor, and then have to ascend to Demon Princehood. Now, I would actually be okay with this version of Perturabo being a Demon Prince, because Perturabo being a Demon Prince of normal chaos is cringe and stupid. Because Perturabo is the least chaosy of probably any of the Primarchs, except for maybe Dawn. But being a Chaos Prince of Vashrro, which even if the two aren't linked, which I believe they are, is still pretty similar to Perturabo. It's a flavor of chaos the Iron Warriors and Perturabo could live with. Even if it isn't a future version of Ascended Perturabo. Because think about it, Perturabo was absolutely wasted and abused by the Emperor. Now don't get me wrong, I fully believe the Horse Heresy was planned, and if the Horse Heresy was planned, why would he be such a dick to Perturabo? Perturabo carried the entire heresy. If he wanted the heresy to be an uneven fight, straight up, just be a dick to Lehman Russ or the Khan. Have either of them fall to chaos instead of Perturabo, and the heresy would have been a minor inconvenience. The entire heresy was carried by Perturabo, and the entire reason why the Chaos Legions are still even somewhat of a threat to the Imperium is only because of Perturabo. Perturabo has essentially become an arms dealer of chaos. Abaddon may be the War Master, but at the end of the day, Abaddon is very subservient to Perturabo. If Perturabo stopped selling weapons and equipment, Cadia would have never had fallen, and the Chaos Legions would grind to a halt. So the Emperor would obviously want to keep Perturabo close, and on top of all this, Perturabo hated the Mechanicum. But he was so industrious, he was so perfect with massive industrialization. In fact, the Iron Warriors probably went through millions of Space Marines given their casualty records. Think about that for a second. The Ultramarines, which was so impressive for them to have 300,000 men, Perturabo was able to burn through millions of Marines. I don't get me wrong, it was very stupid of him to do that. He could have had an army of millions. It was very stupid and ignorant of him to use those kinds of World War I-esque strategies. But at the end of the day, he was the only Primarch to go through millions of Marines and to not use the Mechanicum. There were other legions like the Iron Hands and Salamanders who didn't use the Mechanicum very much. But guess what? Those guys had a very limited amount of Marines and equipment. So it did make sense for Rogel Dorn to be chosen as Praetorian of Terror, But Perturabo should have been given some kind of position where he's given a crap ton of resources and just allowed to build a bunch of OP structures, OP factories, OP planets, and OP war gear, weapons, war crimey stuff, and not to mention massive ships. Imagine if you tell Dawn to let Perturabo poke around the phalanx for a little bit, and you give Perturabo a ton of resources, and the next thing you know, you have like a little 10 phalanxes that are better than the original, that are made in a relatively short amount of time, that are fully stocked with Iron Warrior Space Marines, and a bunch of war crimey tier weaponry. And I fully believe that given enough time, Perturabo and the Iron Warriors could have essentially replaced their Mechanicum. Now, don't get me wrong, he couldn't replace them fully, and Perturabo is such a bitter little shit that he would have been so hard to work with people, and the Iron Warriors themselves would never be able to replace the Mechanicum. But what I'm saying is, if the Emperor just roughed out the edges of Perturabo, made him a bit more sociable, calmed him down a bit, maybe, fanned his ego, made him feel appreciated, I believe he could have had massive amounts of regular mortal humans working under him that could have eventually replaced the Mechanicum, or at least been a secondary source to get weapons. Even if it was like a 30-70 split, it would have been very useful to have a secondary, kind of Mechanicum that was obviously very loyal. Because it took 200 years of Perturabo being a salty little troll and being sent on the worst possible missions just to try to get praise. Like, straight up, Emperor goes to Perturabo and says, I love you. Gives him a hug, says, hey, can you, build me 10 phalanxes? Perturabo's just gonna cry and be like, yes, father, I would love to. Hey, man, can you, take 100 planets and, fully industrialize them to help replace the Mechanicum? I would love to, father. Thank you for letting me build. Just give Perturabo a bone, and he would give you the world. That's what I'm saying. So, I think that the Emperor might have made some kind of deal with Vashrro. I have no idea what for. Maybe to help make the Primarchs, maybe to... I don't know what to. I have no idea, honestly. I'm genuinely grasping at straws. I have no idea. This is a stupid theory. To be a dick to Perturabo, so that way either A, Perturabo can eventually fall to Chaos, particularly fall to Vashrro, so that Perturabo can eventually become Vashrro, or more likely, the much more sane, realistic theory, he was a dick to Perturabo, so that way when Vashrro does, become a full-on Chaos God, he can have his own Primarch. Now, that theory is a billion times more likely than Perturabo actually becoming a Chaos God. That is straight up just copium, and it really shows who my favorite character is, that I would cope and just speculate and just have a tirade of this degree that Perturabo would become a demon, that Perturabo would ascend to become a Chaos God. That. Is it possible? Yes. Is it possible for me to get struck by a meteorite and win the lottery tomorrow? Also yes. More likely, the Vashrro, who was just like an Echo back then, helped the Emperor with something, so that way the Emperor would be a dick to Perturabo, just so that way Perturabo could then be a puppet / business partner of the future 5th Chaos God. That is a billion times more likely. To be honest, I mostly use this unhinged tirade of Perturabo becoming a Chaos God just to get people to listen. I'm sorry. The Emperor just abusing Perturabo and being a dick to him, so that way he would then fall to Chaos, so that way, Vashrro could have a new plaything in the future was 10 times more likely. Sorry to sound like a broken record. And if that's not true, if this unhinged tirade was for nothing, then the Emperor was just straight up an idiot. Because, again, Perturabo would have just been so much more useful, building technology, improving upon technology. Imagine, the Emperor's working on his Webway project, and he can just set the Iron Warriors, on Mars or somewhere, even Olympia, and just say, hey, Perturabo, improve guard uniforms, improve las guns, improve bolt guns, just make everything better and more efficient. And Perturabo, even given just the slightest amount of praise, would just make the best possible thing. In a few years, you'd have a las gun that can take down a Space Marine. So yeah, either the Emperor is just straight up an idiot and a bad father, which is entirely possible. Either way, there's still a good chance that Vashrro had something to do with the cybernetic revolt. Although, me personally, although I do think it's entirely possible, and in the future it's probably going to be either confirmed or hinted at. Again, I'm sorry to backtrack given that you have unfortunately sold your soul to me and sat through this unhinged, disgusting tirade. But I personally like the idea that the cybernetic revolt just happened on its own. Because I feel like not everything needs to tie back to chaos. It's such a big, beautiful universe that tying everything to chaos kind of limits it. So yeah, I personally don't think the cybernetic revolt happened on its own, but I really, really wish it does. I genuinely feel like I have lost most of my remaining sanity and brain cells recording this video, and I feel like by the time I'm done editing this and I get to posting it, I'm actually going to be clinically brain dead. I would just like to apologize. I would like to apologize for making you sit through this god-awful schizophrenic rant. What's your opinion on, like, the 5,000 theories I just spat upon you in this unholy, disgusting, warp abomination of a video? What's your opinion on all of this? Please leave your thoughts and opinions down in the comments. I will do my best to read them all. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please make sure to like, subscribe, comment if you want more unhinged, mentally ill rants. I genuinely can't believe that I had theories lapping over theories, and none of them are possible or really well polished. So yeah, I'll catch you in the next one. But hey, it's just a theory. A 40k theory. Thanks for watching.